Hey everybody, it's Blake, and today I'm going to be talking about perms or permutations. This is a really foundational and really important argument for progressive debating, and it is also one that causes a lot of confusion and has a lot of misconceptions out there, so I wanted to give it its own entire video. A perm is by definition, a permutation, a way in which a set or number of things can be ordered or arranged. So you may have heard this in like math class. The difference between a combination and a permutation is that a permutation has a specific order. That's more or less true for debate, but really I just give that example to hopefully remind you of a time that you've heard the term permutation before. In debate, the definition of a perm that is more useful is that a perm is a test of competition. So what is competition? Competition is a burden of the negative debater to only read advocacies that directly disprove the AF. So what this means in practice is that if the negative debater makes the decision to read an advocacy, that advocacy being desirable should necessarily prove that the affirmative advocacy is undesirable. In other words, if the negative reads an advocacy that can coexist with the affirmative, that does not prove that the resolution is false or undesirable and therefore does not negate. So to put that in practical terms, for an example, if the AF plan is that the U.S. should increase cooperation with NATO, a competitive advocacy for the neg would be that the U.S. should withdraw from NATO. Because if the neg proves that withdrawing from NATO is desirable, that means inherently that increasing cooperation with NATO is undesirable. And that's because those two ideas are competitive. They are mutually exclusive. They cannot coexist. You cannot both withdraw and increase cooperation. So that is a competitive advocacy. Whereas a non-competitive advocacy against that same AF advocacy would be that the U.S. should increase cooperation with the European Union. So in that case, if the U.S. should increase cooperation with the EU, if that is desirable, that doesn't necessarily mean that cooperating with NATO is undesirable. That means proving the negative advocacy true does not prove that the AF is not desirable, which means that you are not proving the affirmative false, which means that that advocacy does not negate. It is not competitive. It can exist at the same time as the affirmative. So that is what competition is. So a perm then is a test of competition. It argues that the AF and neg advocacies can coexist. And if the advocacies can coexist, then the truth of the neg advocacy does not disprove the AF. A perm is by definition an argument made by the affirmative, because if you go back to our definition of competition, competition is a burden of the negative, meaning that if we are going to test whether or not that burden is met, the affirmative is the only one who is going to be doing that testing. In other words, the negative debater can never, under any circumstances, absolutely zero circumstances, perm the AF. That is not something that is possible. The perm is something that is read by the affirmative against the negative. A perm is not a new advocacy. You don't garner offense off of the negative advocacy when you perm it. You rather garner offense off of the fact that your AF does not preclude the existence of the neg advocacy. Think of it as a thought experiment, in essence. You're basically saying, hypothetically, both of these things could coexist. But the signing of the ballot does not enact the perm because the perm is not an advocacy. The signing of the ballot for the affirmative only enacts the AF advocacy, but we know that that's not necessarily a bad thing because the negative advocacy is non-competitive if the perm is true, meaning that the negative advocacy being true does not prove the affirmative advocacy is false. I know that sounds a little bit wordy or complicated, but take the time to understand this because this is a really common tripping point for a lot of people when they're learning about perm debate. So a perm is a thought experiment. It is not a new advocacy. Because you permed a neg advocacy does not mean you garner offense off of that neg advocacy. When should the AF make a perm? Every single time the neg reads an advocacy, the AF should perm it. Even times when it seems pretty clear that the negative is competitive, like in the withdraw from NATO example, we can come up with some creative ways to perm it because a perm is in essence, a silver bullet argument. If the counterplan is not competitive, then the whole thing does not matter for the evaluation of the affirmative case. So, anytime you can take out an argument or take out an entire case with one argument, you should make that argument, right? So every single time the neg reads an advocacy, the AF should perm it. How do you make a perm? I like to teach this as being 3 basic steps to a perm. You name it, you describe it, and you give net benefits. So naming it, you need to say the word perm out loud. Exactly that word, perm, followed by a modifier. It can be something like do both, meaning do both at the same time, or do the AF and then the neg, or do the AF and then 10 years later do the neg, or do the AF as a means to achieve the neg, right? So you say perm do both, or perm do the AF as a means to achieve the neg, or perm do the AF and then the neg. So that is the naming step, is just saying the word perm so the judge knows that that's the type of argument this is, and then giving modifiers that basically explain how the scenario in which the two advocacies can coexist. And then you describe it. What does the world look like if both advocacies were implemented in the way described by the modifier? This is mostly focused on proving that the perm is describing a possible scenario. So for instance, if I were perming the withdraw from NATO counterplan, the describe it part would be really important, because your knee-jerk reaction to me saying both increase cooperation and withdraw is that it's not possible. But if I can effectively describe to you what the world would look like if both happened, then you would be more willing to believe that the perm is a true argument. This essentially resolves any potential logical conflicts. So you name the perm, you describe it, and you give net benefits. Why is the situation described by the perm preferable to just doing the neg? So remember, the perm is not a new advocacy, so you're not arguing why doing both at the same time is a good idea. You're arguing why doing the AF, or including the AF in any capacity with the neg, would be more desirable than just doing the negative. Because even if I prove that both are possible, if the neg is the only one that is desirable, the judge is still going to vote for the neg, because voting AF does not give you access to the neg because the perm is not an advocacy. Most often, the net benefit to the perm is the solvency of the AF. So the reason why we do both is because doing the AF solves climate change, or prevents nuclear war, or whatever it does, and then the counterplan will do whatever the counterplan does. But if I can prove that there is a net benefit to the AF, that there is solvency to the AF, then there is a persuasive reason why doing both would be preferable. So to give an example of this, if I use that non-competitive example I used earlier, where the 1AC says the US should increase cooperation with NATO, the 1NC says the US should increase cooperation with the EU, the 1AR would make the argument as follows. Perm do both. So that's name it. It is possible to cooperate with two organizations, the EU and NATO, at the same time. That's describe it. The net benefit is that we can still use NATO's influence to deter Russia from invading Baltic states, whereas if we only cooperated with the EU, we would be unable to deter Russia successfully. That's your net benefit. So the net benefit is explaining why the affirmative is a necessary component to solving the problems of the impacts described in the round. So now to switch gears to the other side, if you are the neg and somebody perms your advocacy, how do you answer that? Well, there's a couple of options. First, you can prove that the AF is undesirable. In other words, prove that there are no net benefits to the perm. Part of this argument is that links are disads to the perm. If I can prove that the link is true, such as the affirmative increases climate change, or the affirmative relies on discriminatory logic, or anything like that, that proves that tying that negative action to a good action like the negative advocacy is probably a bad idea. If the AF is a bad idea, then don't vote for it, even if it's possible that it can coexist with the neg. It needs to be desirable in order for you to actually want to vote for it. You can also prove that the neg advocacy has to come first, because remember, the perm is not an advocacy, so signing AF only implements the AF. So if the neg advocacy has to come before the AF advocacy, then the ballot must be assigned neg ballot in order to implement that neg advocacy immediately. You can also prove that the perm is illogical, basically taking out the describe it part of the perm. If the AF and neg advocacies cannot truly coexist, if there's no logical way that they can coexist, the neg is competitive. Now remember, being competitive is a necessary but insufficient burden, meaning that it is required for you to win the counterplan, but just winning that you are competitive is not sufficient to win the counterplan. So you still need to prove that the neg advocacy solves or is desirable in some way in order to win off of it. So don't just answer the perm and move on. Extend your solvency and argue why your solvency is solving for impacts that weigh more. So some final thoughts on the perms debate. Perms are a test of competition, which is a burden of the negative competition. Therefore, the AF is the only one who can perm. This is really important. A lot of people, when they're first learning perms, try to make a perm as the negative. It just doesn't work. It's not definitionally correct. The affirmative debater is the only one who can make a perm, so perm should really only be happening in the 1AR, because remember, the 2AR should not have new arguments in it, so the perms are mostly isolated to the 1AR. The AF should perm every negative advocacy, even if you have to get creative and come up with some kind of justification for it. So if I were to have to perm the withdraw from NATO counterplan, I would maybe say perm, do the AF, and then 10 years later do the neg. So we implement the NATO, we increase cooperation with NATO now. We use that time to deter Russia. Once Russia backs down and stops showing signs of aggression 10 years later, we can withdraw from NATO, and that 10 years gives us time to develop another plan, right? As opposed to just withdrawing from NATO immediately would make us susceptible to the Russian aggression that was described in the AF. So even if you have to get a creative and think outside of the box, there's still almost always a way for you to perm it, and you should always try to perm it. And lastly, specific articulations of a perm look a little bit different for a K-alt versus a counterplan advocacy, but the basic parts, name it, describe it, net benefits, are the same. The articulations just look a little bit different because K-alts are typically less concrete, less material, so it's less like doing actions in an order and more like doing actions through the lens of the alternative, or doing the action to achieve the alternative. So the specific articulations are a little different, but the same structure will benefit you regardless of what kind of argument you're trying to perm. That's all I have for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or reach out or anything like that. Hopefully this helps clarify, because like I said, perms are a really important foundational argument for progressive debate. So yeah, hope this was helpful, and have a good rest of your day.